Well, hello again. That's better. Hello again, and welcome to the third and final panel discussion. Thanks very much to the last presentation. Nice to see Star Wars featured. We were just talking about that. I'm Justin Smith, Director of the Cinema and Television History Institute at De Montfort University here in lovely Leicester. And it's my great privilege to chair the final discussion and another panel of eminent guests alongside me. First of all, on my right is Joe Botting, who's curator in the fiction team at the British Film Institute. And Joe presents the monthly screening projecting the archive strand there, and has also been behind a number of very high profile special seasons at the BFI South Bank. Dominic Simmons is also from the British Film Institute. He's the head of cinema technology at the BFI and is a technical specialist in cinema exhibition with long experience, particularly in running the BFI's showcase IMAX cinema. So we're looking forward to talking to Dom about the range of projection formats that is undertaken there and at the BFI South Bank. And last but by no means least, someone who will be familiar figure to many of you, and an absolute pleasure and delight to welcome one of the country's preeminent film collectors, Patrick Moules, who's kindly offered to share his experience of collecting, which goes back a long way, should we say. So the title of this panel is the feature film, and we want to concentrate on fiction film, but very much to keep the relationship between archives and film collecting in the front of our minds. So I would like to begin by asking Joe about the BFI archives engagement with the film collecting community, and wonder if you could just sort of talk us through what happens when you come across a hidden gem, and how does the BFI engage with the community when there's a film that really needs safeguarding and protecting?
Well, you know, we were talking earlier on the panel about collectors and how everyone is an individual, and I think rather than talking about the community of collectors as if you're all, you know, they're all one kind of homogenous group, I think that the point really is that they are all individuals, and so we engage with them as individuals, and that works in very different ways. So I've got people that I've known, been at the BFI 25 years now, and I've known a lot of collectors and come across a lot of collectors, and the relationship really varies so much. So I've got people that I've known a long time who I have a very good friendly relationship with. They don't want to donate their films, and that's absolutely fine. You know, they're within their rights to do that. But occasionally we will take things in on loan from them where we know there's a rare title that we don't have. And that can work really well. Sadly, the resources to actually copy from film onto film are really hard to come by at the moment. So really all we would be doing at this point in time is scanning, although we are trying to set up a wet lab at Berkhamsted at the archive again now, and actually print onto black and white, which I'm really pushing for, because it would be great to make some new prints of all the negatives that we have in the archive that we can't watch because we only have a negative. So there's a lot of work to be done with that. But in terms of actual collectors, it varies very much. So there are some really, really exciting missing silent films, and I know where they are, but I can't get my hands on them. So it's very much about approaching with caution and with respect, and just trying to build a relationship. And sometimes it works and other times it doesn't. But as I said, that, you know, they're all individuals, and, you know, we welcome inquiries with absolutely no obligation. You know, I always happy to have conversations with people about their collections I'm not trying to pin you down or send the police round or any of those things. It's really just about finding out what's there. But obviously, I really appreciate what John's trying to do with today's event, and actually just make people aware that it's really important to let somebody know what you want done with collections, because things ending up goodness knows where is always a real tragedy.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Joe, for that. I wonder if you could say something a little bit more about how the BFI sort of balances the goal of preservation, which of course, as far as rare film is concerned, is always at the forefront of our minds. And the best way of preserving a film is not to show it, which is an awful paradox. With the BFI's policy for making more rare film accessible to a wider audience, which is also very much your priority.
Yeah, it's a really difficult balance, isn't it? I mean, preserve then show is sort of the one of the FIAF's sort of slogan. Preservation has to be the priority. And to go back to the sort of history of film archiving, the first curator, Ernest Lingeren, was very much about preservation, and he would always have 2 copies of everything, one for preservation, one for exhibition. And then you've got Henri Langlois across the channel in France, who just showed everything and ended up with a load of prints that couldn't be shown. So the BFI really established the principles of film archiving, which is like preservation being the priority. And we're very, very lucky in that we were given money to build a state-of-the-art film storage facility in Warwickshire just before the 2008 crash. So we managed to get some money to do that. So we know that the films that we do have, which are very rare and precious, are in the best possible conditions. So that has to be the priority, because if we don't preserve them, then there isn't going to be anything to show. And obviously then the process of deciding what we're going to make available and how we do that is another issue. And actually, we've been largely dependent on lottery money up until now to do all that. So we had our Unlocking Film Heritage project, which was a massive digitisation project for film, which fed into BFI Player, which if you haven't looked at BFI Player, there is a subscription and rental side, but the free stuff is fantastic. We've got lots of British feature films that are free to view and some amazing non-fiction stuff as well. So that all came out of that particular project. Then we moved on to tape digitization, which is actually almost more pressing, because preserving tape is really, really hard. And the machines are all becoming obsolete. And they're hard to, we have to keep the machines going by sort of cannibalizing other machines. So it's an ongoing process. So digitizing all the tapes seemed like a good idea. So, I mean, obviously, the digitizing process has revolutionized how we make things accessible, which is fantastic, but it's not free, it still costs money. And then of course, rights. In terms of feature films, it's about rights. We don't have the right to make everything available. So those negotiations are very complicated too. I mean, BFI DVD does a great job in getting hold of stuff, but it's largely independent films where you can actually negotiate with the filmmaker themselves. So the copyright, I think, is one of the biggest issues we really have in making feature films accessible.
Thanks, Joe. That's really great. Dom, can I turn to you now? And I wonder if you could say, I know you've got experience of screening, an incredible range of different formats. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the kind of challenges of preserving the projecting ability across, lots of endangered and rare and obsolete formats at the BFI.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we probably have the widest range of formats that we can use to screen from the BFI's collections, from other people's collections. So we were able to screen 16mm nitrate. We're the only cinema in the UK to screen nitrate, 570, 1570 at the archive, and we still screen separate magnetic film with 16mm generally. So yeah, we do have a very, very wide range of equipment that we have to keep running. And that's one of my core responsibilities, one of the core responsibilities of my team. But what I always say when people ask me this question is actually, I'm quite bullish about it, because a lot of this equipment was built to last. And if it's preserved in a kind of a dry, relatively humidity-free environment, like a projection box, and you have knowledgeable people maintaining it, looking after it day to day, then you can keep this equipment running for a very long time. And actually, during the Film on Film Festival back in June in South Bank, I was talking to someone who worked in conservation preservation in Maine, and they were saying, oh, we kind of had different viewpoints on what was going to keep film available for the public. His idea was that it was going to be increasingly hard for people to actually maintain equipment and keep equipment running to show film. My viewpoint was actually the problem is more to do with the prints and making sure that there are prints available in good enough condition to screen to people of a wide enough quality. So I'm relatively bullish about it. I'm not saying it's entirely easy, but a lot of this equipment was built to last. For example, in 2018, we stripped out some electronic film projectors, Kineton ones, and we replaced them with some DP70s that I purchased from a film projector collector from Denmark. And these DP70s were built in 1963, and they were still functioning perfectly well. He kept them in a shipping container in the northern Danish town of Aalborg with humidity control, I should say, but he kept them for 20 years. And we installed them, and we had to do relatively little work to get them up and running. We just replaced some of the wiring, rewired them, new oil, and it was amazing how easy it was to actually get them up and running. So in terms of keeping the equipment going, it's complicated, it's complex, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so, you know, from a projectionist point of view, you also have a relationship with the collecting community in terms of expertise and equipment and so on. There's a sort of dialogue there that your example just illustrates.
That's correct. And I think because all kind of mainstream ways of getting equipment, getting supplies, getting spares have essentially ceased to exist. We use Cinemecanica projectors at South Bank, and the main Cinemecanica supplier was Sound Associates, and they're based in West London. They don't really have any film engineers anymore, and they have kind of random spares. So I actually kind of raided their warehouse and collected all the Vic 8 spares I could find from them, just to ensure that I could keep it going. And a lot of time you're relying on collectors, you're relying on enthusiasts. So I bought another DP70, Philips DP70 projector from a collector based in Shropshire, and he built gate bands in his shed. He had 3 DP70s. Loved the equipment, loved keeping them going, had little film screenings himself on a tiny screen in his shed. His wife despaired of him. But it was great. And the other people, you just have to source networks. And there was a sadly died now, a guy in Holland called Ronald Rosebeek, again, a real DP70 enthusiast, a fantastic engineer who kept and maintained DP70s and built spares for them. And he actually fabricated me a dual light source sound reader for both projectors. So when I installed the DP70s, I managed to get hold of this guy in Holland to build me something from scratch using fiber optics as well as the kind of original equipment. So there are people out there, and I mean, I think we are slightly running out of time in terms of the real kind of engineers, the real film enthusiasts, because they're of a certain generation, and a lot of that knowledge is gradually disappearing. But it's also about knowing the people in your own team and ensuring that they can be trained up to use the equipment, to maintain the equipment. And we've got a fantastic in-house engineer, a guy called Ed Morga, who's been working with film since the early 90s. And I mean, he's diversified into digital as well. And I managed to snag him to work for us 2 days a week. But he's a fantastic film engineer as well as a digital cinema engineer. So kind of maintaining that kind of knowledge within the team and also with wider networks and with collectors, etc., is very important.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was also going to ask you about the issue of the loss of knowledge, because it's not just the rarity and scarcity of equipment and parts, but how do we ensure that knowledge, the knowledge that's shared by a large number of people in this room probably about film projection and about projectors is retained? Because the danger is when the equipment becomes obsolete, the knowledge is lost, and we know that from the past in other technological transitions, don't we? So I wonder, I mean, obviously you've given the example of a colleague there who is being sort of trained up, but have, in a sense, of the BFI got a way of prioritizing that knowledge transfer for the future in terms of training programs that could still involve, what I might call mechanical projection.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we don't do well as an organisation. I mean, we do succession planning internally, but actually, as far as creating external networks of engineers and enthusiasts, I don't think the BFI has really stretched itself as much as it could have done. And I think it's worth doing, because there are still plenty of other cinemas out there who can show film. I mean, this is becoming rarer and rarer, of course, but I think at our last tally, there were over 50 cinemas who still showed film kind of relatively regularly. So there is the knowledge out there. I mean, and also with the digital transition, you had a lot of projectionists losing their jobs. And these projectionists, I mean, it's not like they disappeared off the face of the earth. There are still, in this room, I imagine, plenty of people who can lace a 35mm projector, a 60mm projector, screen a film from film. So the knowledge is there. It's actually kind of making sure you can find these people and you can kind of support them and learn from them, and also encourage them to teach other people. But succession planning, as well as maintaining the equipment, I think succession planning is a key part of my role as well. And possibly the thing I'm most worried about in my team at the moment is in the IMAX, we have a fantastic technical manager, a guy called Michael Ford. He's a real industry veteran. He's been working in cinema projection from the mid-70s. He's got 40 years of experience with Odeon, and he joined us. He's been working at the BFI IMAX since 2012, and his knowledge of really specialist projectors like the IMAX GT 1570 is kind of unique. So he's a worry of mine, because he's brilliant. He's a very, very lively, vibrant 66-year-old. And I keep saying, how many more years can you give us, Michael? And he says he's happy to stick around a few years more, which is great. And I think what will probably happen is, as you know, the IMAX is very, apart from Oppenheimer recently, which was almost entirely film, is very much more digital. But actually keeping Michael on board, using his knowledge as a consultant after he's potentially retired, that kind of thing is important. So making sure we make use of the knowledge that already exists, that we know about.
Absolutely, thanks.
Can I just butt in really quickly? And of course, the same thing applies at the archive, where we've got massively skilled film technicians working on all kinds of film material and checking it and comparing it and repairing it. And that's something that needs to be thought about as well, where that knowledge goes when people retire and how that is transmitted to the next generation. Yeah,
and that's a very interesting point that you both make there. And in terms of the knowledge and skills preservation, I'm also conscious as an academic that the number of universities and film schools that actually train and pass on those skills as part of their programs is quite rare. There are only 2 or 3, I think, institutions to my knowledge that have kind of MSCs in film archiving that have those real scientific and engineering skills and technical skills as part of their program. Yeah, and I'd say that maintaining and sustaining videotape machines is even harder than film projectors. They're very, very complex. And there's a lot of good engineers at the archive, but they're not going to stick around forever. Yeah, good point. Which brings me on to just a final question, Dom, about the sort of future proofing and the transition to the digital age. And this is crystal ball gazing a little bit, but I'd be interested in whether what you or Joe thought about our chances for archiving the future, and whether the digital realm promises to be more challenging, perhaps, than the analog age with which we're all engaged in working to preserve as it is.
I think it's going to be harder. I think with a film print, you have something physical. You can hold it. You can see every single frame, and you can produce new film prints from that existing object. I think it's quite interesting in terms of film, but it's also interesting in terms of games technology as well. The BFI is starting to look more about games technology, and you're having to preserve the original equipment that these games have been played on. So that's going to get harder. You've got obsolete formats, and we're talking about tape, keeping tapes preserved. Things like U-matic and VHS even. I mean, we're struggling with those already. So it's only going to get harder. I think the current playback format, DCP, I mean, it's been with us for nearly 20 years now, so it's already quite an embedded technology that eventually will be superseded, and we'll have to make sure we still retain the existing cinema servers that we can play back DCPs from. I mean, it's quite strange to think about it now, but yeah, there will be a lot of stuff will be superseded. You know, we'll have holographic technology, God knows what else is coming down the line. So yeah, I think obsolescence is probably more of a danger in digital formats than it is in analog film formats.
And it's far more expensive to archive digital material than it is to stick a film on a shelf. Absolutely. Because we have to keep backing up. We have every LTO, every new generation of LTO tape, we back up. One tape goes to another location. It's all about making sure that you're properly backed up and stored in different places. It's phenomenally expensive to do that. But also the other issue with digital is the sheer amount of it. I mean, you look on YouTube, there's thousands and millions of videos on there. What as an archive, what do we keep? How do we select from that? How do we keep that stuff? I'm glad that my collecting specialism ends at 1990, because I don't even want to get involved with the whole world of digital, because it's far more complex than film archiving.
And as the democratization of film production has increased, more films are being made by more different types of people, and it's a lot easier to do that, which is great, fantastic. But if you're into preserving it, then yeah, where do you start really?
Yeah, so there's questions.
No answers here.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's questions there about, you know, what the canon is, and what the, you know, in a diverse digital world, you know, it was easier to make those decisions in the past to some extent. But also those decisions are made by film collectors in their own personal acquisitions, and that brings me very much on to Patrick. And I wonder if you'd begin by telling us how you started collecting film, Patrick.
Well, probably by accident, I suppose. I'm a child, obviously, of the very early 50s, and in those days, there wasn't a lot of access to vintage film, as we would call it in the collecting circles. And indeed, I think I was probably about 5 before I even attended a cinema. I lived in the country, you know, I don't think the house had electricity for a while. And I got dragged off one weekend to have my first experience of the cinema, which I regard with complete trepidation. But obviously, being a well-brought-up young lad, I did as my father told me, joined him, and we went to a news theatre in Bristol, where they were showing this selection of shorts and cartoons. And I was telling our friends here earlier on, I remember going up the steps, the beam was ahead of me, otherwise it was dark, and there was this musical noise, I would call it, because obviously the cinema sound then was rather full volume and not very hi-fi. And suddenly I came into this area where this picture was going on, and I was completely entranced. I was completely taken over in a matter of minutes. And as I say, my poor father had to sit through the continuous performance 3 times before actually successfully dragging me out. Now, that is obviously a kind of happenstance, because I could have gone to somewhere else, an agricultural show or whatever. But from that time, and as I say, being a child of the early 50s, where you were encouraged to do things, you know, go out and buy some kit from the army surplus stores and build something, usually a dismal failure, but great fun doing it. So my project then was, I had to have my own cinema. Didn't matter if it was in the coal shed, you know, running some scruffy old film that wasn't even complete. Provided I could try and recapture that experience, that's what I wanted to do. So that's what set me off. And I had encouragement from parents, from schools, from other friends, and it was an absolutely ideal way to start in a hobby that became a complete passion. I think my wife, who also has almost given up on me, regards it as an obsession. But there we are. At least she knew I was coming in with that when she decided to marry me. So from there on, I say I had to have my own home cinema. And I had to have the curtains, I had to have the dimming lights, and I had to have some adverts. And it suddenly occurred to me that what I was also striving to recreate was the showmanship and skill of presenting a cinema show as I found when I first went to the cinema. So it was the way the sound cinema developed in the 30s, possibly enhanced by the war to a degree, and then the wartime recovery, which I then came in on, and just totally enjoyed this experience. So I started ringing around. I managed to find a CATHI sound projector, a 9.5mm one. Now, my motives in buying this are completely flawed. I acquired this machine for all the wrong reasons because I couldn't afford 16mm. It took me about a matter of weeks to reject standard 8 silent sound because it didn't assist me in doing the sound cinema and a decent presentation. So I found this machine, I acquired it. It was a bit like finding a second-hand Rolls Royce when you're expecting to find a Mini. With it was a box of film. And quite frankly, I just couldn't stop from there. And so I think a lot of collectors I know, and perhaps people here will relate to this, is that you suddenly found a love of something that you could actually participate in. And again, something that was said a little earlier, the beauty of actually owning a projector, sometimes a camera, although I wasn't so much keen on filming, a can of film. It's so entirely mechanical and tactile. And you end up hopefully repairing a film, maybe restoring it. And then you suddenly find you can't resist buying the next one. And that's how the collection starts. I love the film. Projectors were okay, but they were secondary. I had an extremely good chum. It was the other way around. So that was good. No punch-ups behind the bike shed. So who was going to buy the film or the projector? You know, we linked the two together and it worked very well. And probably I've made more friends across a wide spectrum of society because of my film interests and their film interests, where we've been able to link together. So I think if that gives you some idea of the motivation of me personally, and I suspect a lot of other people can relate to this, that's how I started.
Marvelous, fascinating, and that desire to recreate the experience of cinema, sort of at home, as it were. You know, how soon did you begin to share that with others and put on sort of film exhibitions in public?
Well, fairly soon. I mean, I suppose from having the basic idea to getting something that was up and running that was I could show the layman, including my parents, of course, was probably the best part of a year because I had to work at it. Because again, early 50s or later in 50s, by the time I was getting the equipment, what's easy today, just finding the information was several weeks' work if you were lucky. You know, you couldn't just Google it. And so it took a little while, but I think the biggest prod I had to making sure I carried on with this was my father's famous comment when he picked me up in Bath to pick up this projector that I'd acquired for £5. And he eyed this balefully, this box of stuff, and said to me, I don't know what you're buying that for. You'll never get it working. Well, after that, I just had to, didn't I? And so probably the first public show, if I could call it that, was insisting he join me one morning once I got this thing working, and it did take a lot of doing, and actually showing him this film. And I was reminiscing earlier that the film I ran was a 1936 British Lion musical on 9.5mm, nice picture, not bad sound for such a small optical track. And it was called Soft Light and Sweet Music. And it featured principally Ambrose and his orchestra, but any number of routines and stars and singers of the day. As a plot, it was hopeless, but as a slice of history, especially looking at it now, and I love running it now even after all these years, it was just perfect. And I suddenly thought then, this is the closest we've got to a very imperfect time machine. And it is.
Fascinating. And did the attraction of 9.5, was that because you were fortunate enough to find that projector for £5, or was it because it was
as I say,
cheaper?
It was entirely money led. I probably would have quite liked a 16mm machine. You know, I'm a schoolboy, for heaven's sake, you know, in fairly restricted times. And it was only through good fortune I found out about this 9.5 machine and talked the boss of this camera business into letting me have it for a £5. You know, he was desperately worried because he couldn't offer me a guarantee. I said, I don't want a guarantee. You know, I might dump it in a fortnight's time, but I'll have a little bit of fun trying it, you see. And I think that appealed to him, and that's how I got it. But as I say, one of the best things I ever did for all the wrong reasons initially.
Yeah.
Because it was money-led, I'm afraid, as many of my film collection acquisitions have been subsequently.
But from chatting to you, an amazing array of films actually survive on 9.5. I mean, in your collection and others, which you've sort of dedicated yourself to, but must have surely one of the greatest collections of 9.5 millimeter.
Well, I think it is pretty comprehensive, but the thing that kind of followed on, because I found some of my school chums, much to my surprise, were quite interested, even looking something from the 30s, black and white, you know, and that was nice and sociable. And so this burgeoning interest and passion, I joined the BFI. I joined various organizations for enthusiasts, like Group 9.5, for example, the Vintage Film Circle. And the more I did, the more I seemed to learn, and the more it suited what attracted me about this subject. And then, lo and behold, off I went to London to university. And so the people who appeared as names in these magazines and journals, I started meeting. And guess what? We got on rather well together, having a sort of interest in common. And so the more I met and related to these people, the more I learned about the subject, the more I learned about absolutely rare films that no one in this country could have seen in whole or in part at that time, unless you were actually in this film collecting community and who were looking back a little bit on the old Kodak Kodascope prints or on 9.5. Because I'm sure you all know 9.5 is a product of Pathé Cinema in France. Absolutely worldwide colossus, and therefore they had all the resources to provide any number of print copies, the resources to get really good engineers producing stuff that people in their homes could use, and which lasted the test of time with a bit of care and consideration. And I always remember I went to one of the screenings in one of the filthiest pubs you could imagine in Fleet Street one Saturday evening. The club had hired this nicotine-dripping first-floor room. We had an old Swiss projector still on a table, on a chair, and a couple of books in between, waving around. The print was missing a title, but it was Jacques Fader's film called Visage d'Enfant, in the English version, which only ran for about half an hour. And yet I didn't know what to expect. I just went along. And going back to my digs on the tube, I just could not get that film out of my head. So that's why, rather than giving up the collecting hobby, it just became worse and worse and worse, I'm afraid.
Well, I'm sure we're all grateful that it did. And you also dabbled in other more obscure formats as well.
Well, yes. I mean, needless to say, I suppose in a way, I did have a kind of purpose in my collecting, in that I wanted to recreate the cinema as I particularly remembered it, and was still pretty well much the same in those days. And therefore, obviously, the more material I could have that was a genuine cinema film in one form or another, was almost the thing that led me to saying, well, I'll buy that film, but I won't buy that. And needless to say, you can't get everything on 9.5 millimeter. I don't think you'd want to. So I suppose my second rather ill-advised incursion was into another Pathé gauge called 17.5 millimeter, which I guess had been their 1920s answer to Kodak's 16 millimeter. In many technical ways, it made a lot more sense than 16 millimeter. And again, that just basically followed the same progression that 16 millimeter had: silent prints, later on became talkies, you know, with soundtracks on one side. And so I had a go at that then for some of the British black and white, rather obscure sound films from the 1930s. The only problem was that the machinery for this particular gauge made in France, again, was not easily accessible in England. The home-produced thing, I really think, was made by Spong mincemeat manufacturers, because it used to wreck prints almost beyond the control of the projectionist. So I didn't last very long with that until later on when I went back to it with French equipment. So I suppose my third move into this was 16mm, which I had quite a lot of experience of, because, you know, as a child of a 1960s grammar school, word soon went round that there was a character actually amongst the pupillage who could actually operate one of these Bell and Howell projectors. And any number of English teachers and similar history teachers would seek me out to actually project films they'd hired for the lessons. So I became a bit of a 16mm expert in their view. I just thought it was easy, but there we are. And so, you know, it was either that or someone could operate the ferrograph tape recorder. So it was all up here, you know, it was well and truly in the head. I couldn't give it up. It was my fix.
And this is possibly a cheeky question to ask you, or maybe a difficult one to answer, but of all the films you have, and I know they range across different international cinemas as well, what for you was the greatest find?
Oh, that really is a tricky question. I mean, I always thought it was a bit like going onto Desert Island Discs. You know, you'd be asked the question one week and you come up with 10 titles or whatever. 3 months later, you come up with some rather different ones. I think perhaps discovering some of these films that I only ever heard about, getting my hands on, say, like a Technicolor print of the life and death of Colonel Blimp. Yes. I mean, that's a film that I'm just utterly fascinated with. I can run it time and time again. I'm almost there with the dialogue ready before they speak it. And then all of a sudden I see something I hadn't seen before, something really clever, you know. And so a beautifully produced film like that, which I then got my hands on, the tactile stuff again, made sure it was okay, spliced, leaders, all this sort of business, put it on a reliable projector. It, you know, it really is, to me, maybe not to many other people, but a lot of people here, I think, just a wonderful experience. And it just so enhances the basic film watching.
That's a really interesting point, and I was actually going to sort of thought I'd wind up the discussion by asking each of you, you know, in a sense, what you think we've lost about film in the digital age. You've kind of answered that just now, Patrick. I mean, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that.
Well, but can I perhaps
please
make what in many circles would be a controversial point? After lots of pushing and advice and comments from my own children and friends and people, I was sent off to see Oppenheimer. And it was this, it had a wonderful score, you know, they got the time lapse between the explosion and the flash right. And I sat there, and within 10 minutes, I thought this was one of the lousiest bits of film presentation and assembly that I remember seeing for many a year. Whoever put that together was just doing the technicalities. They didn't have the view of how the film was presenting itself. The music didn't accompany it, just overwhelmed it. It had no relevance to the action, and it was just damned poor, in my view. Now, in the old days, when films were being put together and shown in cinemas, you had a trained guy who could lose his job if he showed the countdown tabs. And they just presented it so well. And I always remember I had in my possession once a print of Dangerous Moonlight, the Warsaw Concerto film. Now, there was a bit of a glitch in the production, 35mm production prints of that. And the projectionist was advised on the leader that you had to play this at so many decibels above the BS 1930 settings. Now, no one would even know what that meant today. There's no projectionist actually operating this digital stuff in the average cinema to correct as best they can, blitz soundtracks, poor quality picturing. You know, it's just become mindless tapping keyboards like so much of life. I'm sorry, end of rant.
I think you should have come to see Oppenheimer at the BFI IMAX. So.
Well, that is something I intend to do because but you see, with due respect, you chaps know what you're doing. And you've got the best possible material. I don't see how you're going to sort out that damn's music track, but anyway, perhaps you can invite me along and show me.
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, there's some things we can't change, but I mean, yeah, I mean, Oppenheimer in 1570 at the IMAX is a kind of overwhelming experience. Yeah, I think it's cinema as cinema was intended to be shown. I mean, it's fantastic, and
But so much better, couldn't it be?
I mean, I'm no great lover of Nolan, but I think he knows how to put on a show. Let's put it like that. And the IMAX print of it is kind of a very complex endeavor. It's 50 individual reels. Took the technicians 2.5 days to make up, and it's 11 miles.
Yeah,
11 miles.
You've still got technicians. And at this point, I'm quite an admirer of Nolan, but I cannot believe for 1 minute he actually had the approval of that final assembly.
I think Nolan can do what he likes, but I guess we can.
No. What he does,
He's not here to tell us.
he produces a film and then Hollywood buggers it about.
Joe, do you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, it's complex because, Patrick's obviously talking about his own experience of viewing cinema. It's quite different for me. As I said, I'm very much happier with celluloid than I am with digital artifacts.
Me too, without a doubt.
Because it's just so much easier. And as Dom said, you can see it, you know what it is. It's much easier to archive. It's much easier to deal with. But I think, I think in a way you can't stand in the way of progress. And digital delivery has revolutionized cinema in the sense that you're not carting prints all around the country anymore. And it really, you look back on that. But what I think is a real shame is the way that cinemas were so quick to jump on digital. They ripped out all their 35mm projectors and
straight into a skip.
Yeah, I think the two could have carried on side by side. I don't see why not. Because obviously the BFI, we just had this project to make new prints now. And although there are 50 cinemas, there could be a lot more, places to show them. But again, the big thing we did find with making those new prints is how hard it is actually to make new prints now, because a lot of the studios, they're not going to let you get access to their original negatives. So the fact that people like Nolan and Tarantino, for example, have actually kept celluloid alive to some degree. And I think we're sort of over that complete getting rid of celluloid and only using digital. And I think the two things can hopefully carry on side by side now and more. I went to see a film at the London Film Festival shot on 8mm Super 8, which obviously is exhibited digitally, but filmmakers are looking at different formats to produce a different look.
Well, that's encouraging.
I wonder if I could just make one very final quick point.
Quickly, Patrick, please.
In mitigation, in case you think I really am a dinosaur, I am not dismissing digital or video. In the last probably 10, 15 years, because of the availability of material that I never thought I'd ever see, I've seen films courtesy of DVDs and other systems on digital, which have been an absolutely beautiful experience. I mean, the fact they tend to be perhaps restorations of vintage stuff doesn't diminish the fact that without this newer technology done well, my collecting experiences and viewing experiences would have been considerably less. So I'm not dismissing video or digital, but I just wish sometimes they could look back a bit on the standards that prevailed when we had the tactile celluloid and just see what we may be actually throwing out with the bathwater. So I rest my case.
On that note,
shut up.
On that note, we'll leave it. Thank you very much indeed. Big hand for our panelists, please. Thank you.